This is why I hate the South Carolina Gamecocks. And I do hate the South Carolina Gamecocks.
You are Locked On Ole Miss, your daily podcast on the Ole Miss Rebels. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to the Locked On Ole Miss podcast, the most watched Ole Miss podcast around. I am your host, Steven Willis, a 10-year veteran member of the national media and a former Ole Miss staff member. Today's show, we dive into why I hate the South Carolina Gamecocks and how everything is about the pre-playoff lead-up last year. We'll break down to see exactly how the Ole Miss and South Carolina game will unfold as we return to Oxford after a two-game set against Georgia and Oklahoma this fall, even with some work on the roster left to be done. We'll talk about that. We'll also discuss the significance of this matchup for Ole Miss and why it's the game that will truly understand where the Ole Miss football team stands after it. Remember, we're free and available on all the podcast apps and on YouTube. Thanks for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. And a special hello to the insiders and everydayers who make the show what it is. And don't forget to check out a second listen on the network. Chris Gordy at Locked On SEC, or Corey Burton at Locked On Vandy, or Chris Marler at Locked On Gamecocks. They offer different perspectives on college football, the SEC, and yes, sometimes even Ole Miss. So I'm going to be perfectly honest. South Carolina was kind of in that category like the Oklahoma Sooners leading up to last season. They were a team that Ole Miss played once every 8 years. Sometimes Ole Miss won, sometimes Ole Miss lost, but at the end of the day, it didn't really matter how it went. It was just a typical game against an SEC East opponent. South Carolina Gamecocks, monetarily and status-wise, they were a similar type program to the Ole Miss Rebels. It just wasn't really worth getting worked up over. And then last season happened. And we all know that Ole Miss went 9-3, missed the playoffs. But South Carolina went 9-3 and missed the playoffs, and every good team that they played, they got beat by. But that didn't stop some members of their media department, some members of their coaching staff, and just basically an all-around campaign to get South Carolina into the playoff over Ole Miss and over Alabama, both of the teams that beat South Carolina. And they were incessant. They were annoying. They were everything that was wrong with college football and social media. They were almost bot level of how annoying they were during this whole lead up. They claimed that South Carolina deserved to make the playoff over Ole Miss and Alabama for every reason other than the fact that those two teams beat them, that those two teams won the game, that South Carolina was not able to work against those two teams, but South Carolina still claimed that they belonged in the playoff over Ole Miss and Alabama because they beat Clemson, because they beat Vanderbilt, because they beat, Missouri. Every good team that South Carolina played a year ago, they lost to. Now, granted, the LSU game might have been some shenanigans. We'll just say that. But they got their butt kicked against Ole Miss to the point where if that game was 8 quarters long, South Carolina would not have scored a touchdown against Ole Miss. It was an absolute butt kicking. And I think even the South Carolina folks would tell you about that. Remember the game? Do you remember that lead up to the South Carolina game? Juice Wells coming back to South Carolina. Juice Wells wants to play with a big-time quarterback. All of the lead up in the South Carolina fan base to that game. Well, what really happened in that game is South Carolina completely got dominated. And Ole Miss was basically a fumble out of the back of the end zone and some drop passes away from that being a 41 or 48-3 type game. It was a beatdown. Absolute beatdown. But that doesn't stop the South Carolina beat writers. It's like, ignore that. That didn't happen. We need to talk a little bit about the Citadel game. I don't know if they played the Citadel, but the James Madison game or the Old Dominion game. That's what it was. It was Old Dominion. Though you see the Old Dominion game, we beat Missouri. And South Carolina campaigned incessantly enough to where when the Peach Bowl, the top non-playoff bowl for the SEC, got to select, they selected South Carolina. In that route, the campaign worked. So all that needed to happen at that point was for South Carolina to beat a good but not great Illinois team in the Citrus Bowl. If you would pull that off, your argument would at least hold some water. You would be able to say, see, look, Illinois was real close. What happened in that game? Mike Shula was calling plays for the first time, and South Carolina's offense looked terrible, looked awful. Illinois kind of did what they wanted to do, controlled the game, even started trolling Shane Beamer to the point where he got mentally broken during that game. Shane Beamer is a coach that you can get under his skin. And Brett Bielema was able to do that and completely took South Carolina apart. This team that was supposed to make the playoffs looked absolutely lost against the Illinois Fighting Illini. Every metric for truthfulness of what was going on for South Carolina deserving the playoffs because they beat Clemson got thrown out the window and was embarrassing on January 1st of 2025. Ole Miss played in a bowl game and put 55 points up. And honestly, it wasn't that particularly close. Ole Miss would have beaten Illinois by about the same amount. Nobody was beating Ole Miss that day. Just wasn't. If any team in the Southeastern Conference that was 9-3 deserved to make the playoffs, it was Ole Miss. Ole Miss was the best, most talented team in the entire conference. This is a team that should have went 12-0. A couple months ago, I had a conversation with an LSU fan on the YouTube channel. And that LSU fan was sitting here going, there's no way that Ole Miss is going to be better than they were last year. You know, Ole Miss has lost a 3-year quarterback, and he was starting to give reasons. I mean, he's an LSU fan, why Ole Miss is not going to be good. And his reasoning was me talking about the playoff. And my response to him, and I absolutely mean this, is Ole Miss was a 12-0 team. Ole Miss lost 3 games for reasons other than talent in 2024. They not only should have made the playoffs, they probably should have won the SEC championship and played with a bye. They should have been in Georgia's position for the playoffs. But they didn't for whatever reasons. They dropped the game to Kentucky. They gave one away at LSU. Against Florida, you had 3 really bad drives at the end, and Florida was able to put it away. Those 3 games, that definitely is in the legacy of certain players. Jackson Dart had an unbelievable season, broke every record imaginable. But those 3 drives against Florida are probably going to haunt him until his dying day. But my point is, and everybody should listen to this, is that Ole Miss has the talent on their team to win 10 or 11 ball games this year. It's not as talented a team as they had a year ago. Nothing would be. That team was the most talented Ole Miss football team in history. But this is a team that can win 10, 11 games. Just like T. Martin and that volunteer crew won the national title after Peyton Manning graduated. It is very possible that this team goes on a run, and I am here for it if we're going to be honest about it. So, but this is a revenge game for Carolina after a rough home loss. Can Ole Miss pull off another domination, or will we see a new Lenore Sellers in Oxford? We will break it all down next. This is a big game in Oxford, Mississippi, and after this game is over, we'll know exactly where Ole Miss stands. All preseason expectations and what we're talking about now, they will be really honed in. It would be the magnifying glass of really focusing in on whatever's going on with the football program, and that's a good thing because the LSU game and the Georgia game, Ole Miss is playing for margin for error. LSU is not going to be particularly good, in my opinion. Whenever they were down offensive linemen last year. This was a completely different looking team than they were when everybody was healthy. When there's 3 NFL offensive linemen off of there, it could be a problem for Garrett Nussmeier because as you saw against Florida, this is a quarterback that doesn't deal with pressure. You got the Georgia Bulldogs where Ole Miss is going to get Georgia's absolute best. That's the reason they need that margin for error in the LSU game. because otherwise, if you lose that LSU game and lose to Georgia, you go on the road to Oklahoma, playing South Carolina at home, playing Florida at home, and they can't afford to lose to any of them. You need margin for error. So that is what we're going to be looking at. And Oklahoma is going to be a tricky game. It's going to be a fun game, but it's in the middle. It's kind of set up to be a schedule loss. Ole Miss needs to figure out a way how to get that game. And it is possible that Oklahoma is kind of going through dumpster fire mode when Ole Miss gets to that, depending on how the season goes as well. Listen, Ole Miss went to South Carolina and just absolutely beat down the South Carolina Gamecocks. I mean, it was bad. It was a situation where Ole Miss controlled that game from beginning to end. South Carolina's offense in no way was good enough to make plays. All they had was kind of the tight end dump-off pass that they would throw from time to time. Lenore Sellers was not good. It was a game where he probably should have thrown a couple of picks. They did not throw the ball downfield. Ole Miss controlled that game from beginning to end. In fact, the first drive of the game, South Carolina did the most obvious fake punt in the history of obvious fake punts. Ole Miss predictably stopped it, went down and scored, and all of a sudden, game is on, the race is on. Whatever analogy you want to use, there it is. But South Carolina, if that game would have been played for 8 quarters, South Carolina would not have scored a touchdown. Now, these are two different teams as they were in 2024. Lenore Sellers is a little bit better, but Lenore Sellers traditionally has struggled against teams that have taken his legs away. He's still not good enough of a passer to where if you take his legs away, he is able to still make plays. Illinois completely took his legs away. He was a running no factor. Ole Miss took it away. Alabama took it away at some extent, but not totally. Whenever they played a good team that was able to take away his legs, the other team did. And whenever they did that, they kind of took apart South Carolina. Now, I'm expecting Lenore Sellers as a redshirt sophomore to take a step in 2025. I'm expecting him to be a little bit more polished quarterback in 2025. Now, the offensive coordinator this year is Mike Shula in South Carolina. He did not have the best game against Illinois, but we'll see what it looks like in a Mike Shula offense and Lenore Sellers. Will his NFL roots, where he has been recently, kind of come back into the fold? Or will it kind of be more of the same of what we saw in the Citrus Bowl, and Lenore Sellers is trying to make something happen instead of going out and executing and making stuff happen? Lenore Sellers is a good quarterback, but he's not going to have Rocket Sanders in 2025, who ran like a 4.40 at the NFL Combine. Congratulations, Rocket. That's pretty impressive with as big as you are. Maybe the name is apt. They've got a running back in the transfer portal, but it's not Rocket Sanders, for instance. You know, they have weapons at wide receivers. They have weapons at tight end. But if the offensive and defensive line doesn't get fixed, there's not going to be able to handle it. Because the way that Ole Miss just completely destroyed, embarrassed, humiliated South Carolina in 2024 was by the defensive line whooping the offensive line for South Carolina. South Carolina can't block Ole Miss's defensive line. It doesn't matter anything else that happens. And everybody's going to say, well, Walter Nolan's gone. Princely Amanuelin's gone. J.J. Pegues is gone. Jared Ivey is gone. And that is all true. That is all factual. But did you notice that Ole Miss as a coaching staff didn't really attack defensive line in the transfer portal this year? Everybody's looking for defensive linemen. You've heard that story. Everybody wants defensive linemen. Well, not Ole Miss. And do you know why? Because Ole Miss has recruited defensive line in outside the portal, high school recruiting, and developed them. They had a Mississippi class of 4 or 5 defensive linemen, including William Eccles, including Cam Franklin, Jeffrey Rush, Cam Beavers, those guys, to match with the Suntaran Perkins and Xavion Harris. There's a lot of homegrown Mississippi high school players that are just kind of ready to go. I'm excited to see what Jim Brown can do. He is my favorite defensive lineman right now, and Ole Miss has a nice defensive line. And the key is going to be all season long. This isn't just a South Carolina thing. This is a General overall key. If Ole Miss's defensive line can force 2 double teams, whether it be Jam Brown, Xavier Harris, Santan Perkins, Cam Franklin, whoever is playing on the defensive line, if 2 of those defensive linemen can force a double team, it's going to make the other 2 defensive linemen very effective, the way that the Ole Miss defensive line was a year ago. It's going to make the linebackers even better, and it's going to give the quarterback less time to pick out wide receivers against Ole Miss's secondary, which is going to make that unit better as well. 2 double teams is the key for this team being really good. Listen, our final segment, we will reveal what Ole Miss will turn into after the showdown with South Carolina. Stick around for the breakdown. All right, so after the game, no matter what happens, whether Ole Miss wins, whether Ole Miss loses, no matter what happened in the games before South Carolina, after the South Carolina game, you're going to have the first time the best view at what this Ole Miss football team is. Whether they're going to be a 4-4 team or whether or not they're 7-1. After the South Carolina game is going to be key in determining what this Ole Miss team is, whether or not they're going to make expectations or not. The expectations for this team, honestly, every single year should be the playoffs. If it's not, we're doing it wrong. We're at the point where you need to start talking and speaking stuff into existence, not hiding out and hoping that something good would happen to spare your feelings. You need to openly talk about it to where it's not such a big deal. And once Ole Miss gets to the point where playoffs are not that big of a deal, you would see them start making them more regularly. So we'll see if Ole Miss has the ability to do it. If Austin Simmons and that wide receiver crew and the running back crew and the offensive line and all that get going, this unit has a chance to be better than it was in 2024. Everybody's like, what? What are you talking about, Steve? Jackson Dart, yada, yada, yada. Trey Harris. Yeah. I know what I said. I said what I said. Austin Simmons has more talent than Jackson Dart. He still has a ton of records to make. He still has a ton of playing. Jackson Dart made plays. Austin Simmons still has potential. Jackson Dart has realized potential. That's the difference between those two. But the running back room should be a little bit better with Logan Diggs and Keywan Lacey, with those kind of being the bell cows of the running back room. The wide receiver unit has a chance to be better than it was in 2024, and that unit had Trey Harris. Remember, Trey Harris was injured for about half the season. Trey Harris makes it through the Florida game, almost probably wins that game, if we're going to be honest about it. But he didn't. Just kind of is what it is. But we'll see exactly how it goes. Defensively, the front seven, they are perfectly pleased with the front seven, whether it be the defensive line or the linebackers. Secondary, there's a little bit of work, but there's also a little bit of youth. Everybody needs to remember that. Sage Ryan got moved from cornerback to free safety, which I think is a very good move. Sage Ryan's a smart football player. I think he'll make a good free safety, somebody that's going to be asked to play quarterback on the back end of the defense, and then you can surround him potentially by a Keon Young or a Cortez Thomas or a LaDarian Carty, some sort of young guys with Sage Ryan kind of being the big boss man. So we'll see. Cornerback, Jalen Braxton, I'm fine there. Chris Graves, kind of fine there. Want to see if Cedric Beavers makes a jump. Want to see if Patrick Broomfield makes a jump. Want to see if Mason Dunn is good enough to get on the field as a freshman. This team has a chance to be pretty good. But after the South Carolina game, we should know exactly what they are. All of the questions that we have now, we just did it for like 3 minutes. All of those questions will be answered after the South Carolina game. So when you look at this Ole Miss football team, it just sets up the most important game on the schedule is LSU. The toughest game on the schedule is at Georgia. The most fun game on the schedule is Oklahoma. South Carolina is, I don't know the word right now. the game you need to survive. That's what you need to do against South Carolina. If you can survive against South Carolina, you can find yourself in a pretty good position. If you can make it to that next game, which is an FCS game, where people have a chance to get a little bit better before the Florida game, with a shot at the playoff, the whole goal on this team should be get to the Florida game with a chance to win and you're in the playoffs. Just beat Florida, beat Mississippi State, and you have a chance to make the playoffs. If you can do that, you've done what you're supposed to do. But it's not going to be easy. And it's going to be real because the stretch in the middle of the season is no joke. At Georgia, at Oklahoma, South Carolina at home, unbelievably tough portion of the schedule. Anyway, thank you for making Locked On Ole Miss your go-to source for Ole Miss sports. We pride ourselves on offering the most comprehensive perspectives, which is why we're the number one Ole Miss podcast. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for making Locked On Ole Miss your first listen today. For your second listen, check out Locked On SEC with Chris Gordy. As your favorite conference is getting ready in football, basketball, baseball, whatever, Chris Gordy does an excellent job of covering it from all angles. You can find Locked On SEC on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Hotty toddy, everybody. And remember, analytics is just the old English words that mean bad football. We'll see you later.